Recording ready to go because we're about to start. It involves going into phone settings. Oh, okay. Starting. All right. User. It's my friend. It's User. I love User. They're good peeps. Very good, solid comrade. Everybody. Solid comrade from France. They're Algerian comrade. Okay, in peculiar view of the developing world, let's first examine the approach which suggests that what we need in the developing world is something peculiar. If one is in Ghana, one will think about Ghanaian culture. In Africa as a whole, there is a need for African socialism. It would be said, in India and Sri Lanka, let us look at something that relates to our own culture. These are powerful arguments because they address real emotions. They address the colonial in his conception of himself. The colonial, after all, had been challenged as a being. Sorry, everybody. His very identity had been challenged. He had been exposed to culture imperialism, in addition to the political and economic exploitation, and therefore it rings a certain bell of ethics. Wait. Can't believe I can't. Hold on. Not a good start. Hold on a second. Has you ever come across an easy, simple word and you can't do it? That happened to me just now. Watch when I type it out, it will help. Come on. Oh my gosh, come on. It's taking forever. My pad is on a delay. Why is it going so slow? Come on. Wait. Illicit, so I was right. Illicit sympathy. Then one says we must avoid all foreign domination of thought, and we must ensure that which we create is ours. That we cannot reject cannot reject capitalism or bourgeoisie theory and take in its place socialism or Marxist theory, because that is a new form of impositions. And I think that there are a few Africans, a few Asians who would put forward this kind of argument very ably. And I myself have tried to put it forward without any caricature whatsoever. I think that this is the argument as it would be put forward at its best. And I still feel that at its best it is false for several reasons. First of all, when these individuals are speaking, they are automatically marking the assumption that scientific socialist ideology or Marxist-Leninism is limited in time and space, culturally limited. That is the assumption to the argument, because on that assumption, one can say Marxism was generated within Western Europe in the 19th century. Therefore, if it has any relevance, putting aside that question, its relevance is circumscribed by those factors. It may be relevant to the Europeans. It may have been relevant in the 19th century, or perhaps it is still relevant to Europeans in this country. But it is not relevant to us. That is to say, an African, quote, a developing world person is speaking. It is not relevant to us because of because it is theirs. It is an alien, cultural thing. Later on, one might have to discuss the extent of which Marxism, like an ideology, must of necessity incorporate elements of the culture which produces and fosters the propagates it. But in this position, the fundamental ideological assumption is a bourgeoisie assumption. It's a metaphysical assumption which makes a separation between the application of scientific principles to the society as distinct from the application of scientific principles to the real world, to the natural world, because the very individuals who would see cogently and convincingly perhaps make this kind of argument are individuals who have no qualms about standing before you and using this microphone. They have no qualms of standing before you and using the electricity, the harnessing of the electric energy. And of course, they may be speaking in an African or an Asian or a Caribbean country, but they do not make a fanciful argument which suggests that things which originate in the natural world, the harnessing of principles and understanding the motion of the natural world, would be rejected and priori in the developing world because they were initially discovered in the first world or second or whatever kind of rank you are applying. And without recognizing it, they are subscribing to a certain dichotomy which is their bourgeoisie philosophical worldview. That dichotomy which is perfectly prepared to discover, to seek out at any rate and then discover the principles of motion in the natural world. The capitalists do that because it aids in production. It is an integral part of the capitalist system that they should maximize production, that they should maximize the efficiency of technology, that they should mystify. Certainly, they will not cautiously and deliberately mystify the pursuit of scientific knowledge with the regards of the real world. But when, let me get my drink quick. I'm gonna need it. I have a feeling. But then, by the same token, the bourgeoisie class, the capitalist class, as interest in specifically mystifying the application of scientific principles to society, because the same application of scientific principles to society would suggest that we must understand the changes, the transitions by which capitalism itself came into being, and by which the particular class of power will be removed from power. It would be a study in their own liquidation, if they like, and one perhaps could not reasonably expect the bourgeoisie to promote the study of their own liquidation. No, they would not, because they seek to keep the things going and not to be liquidated, and keep the things taken away from the masses, and to keep the masses subdued and subjugated. And so we find that there is always that contradiction in bourgeoisie thought between the application of scientific principles to society and to the natural world, which is a very artificial distinction. And those who, as I said earlier, are making the argument about cultural validity and cultural uniqueness and particularity are clearly falling victim to this distinction. The moment that we can break beyond that understanding, we can see even further the limitations of a position that tries to see Marxism as culturally distinct and as having no relevance in the developing world. Of these limitations is that it is necessary first to misunderstand deliberately, to misunderstand Marx in order to conduct their own polemics. They will say, for instance, Marx does not deal with with the kinds of society which we have. Marx and Engels were writing about European society, which had classes, and we don't have the same classes. We don't have any proletarian workers, and they may be right. In some countries of Africa, there is hardly any proletariat to speak of. Countries in Latin America and Asia perhaps have larger numbers, but in any event, they are right in saying that the particular class configurations are even the absence of class in the developing world countries does not conform to the model of analysis that Marx might have organized in Western Europe, in which, of course, is relevant to North America. In so doing, however, they overlook that which Marx himself had said, because Marx hadn't claimed that he was organizing a philosophical worldview and that he had created categories for Western Europe which were applicable in and of themselves to the developing world, applicable without any new intellectuals or analytical efforts. Indeed, Marx had to chastise those individuals who of them called themselves Marxists, who would like to have applied his understanding of Europe in a very uncritical way to the development of Eastern Europe. And he had to warn them that Marxism was not a general historical philosophical understanding of the whole world at all times in every place. He made it very clear that which he and Engels had been dealing with was the systematic and detailed formulation of the development of capitalism within Western Europe, and that they had attempted to describe and understand specific features of capitalism specific in Western Europe, so that the universality which both he and Engels claimed was not the universality that applied to Western Europe. The, quote, universality is the universality of contradiction, the universality which can be determined by utilizing a historical materialist method, which relationship to any given society, so that when those individuals say that Marxism claims that all societies must pass through the same processes, and that the important thing is the presence of the given working class in a peculiar way, and that therefore we must of necessity bypass this because our society is unlike that which Marx describes. I think those individuals have fundamentally failed to come to grips with what he was saying, and I didn't think it is merely accidental. I think that there is an element of distortion which is deliberate, and that in itself is a serious reflection on their arguments. Because if you have to engage in deliberate distortion of the opposition's argument before you can come to terms with the argument, it suggests that you yourself are coming from a very weak position. Besides, yet another limitation of the attempts to force Marxism into these narrow boundaries of time and place arises out of the fact that these individuals fail to recognize and accept Marxism as a growing ideology. That is to say, just like with any body of science, it is not static. It takes in new ideas. It has new discoveries. It responds to the variations as scientific inquiries continues. That is why one speaks about Marxist-Leninism. The very fact that we coupled Lenin's name to Marx's name in a very fundamental way is a reflection of Lenin's contribution at a different time. His ability to say, yes, we are looking at capitalism, but we are not looking at the same capitalism which Marx had looked at in the earlier part of the 19th century. Instead, we are looking at capitalism in its imperialist epoch, and this is the qualitatively different thing. So, in that process, Lenin contributed to the growth of Marxist ideology. Because if it's a science, it's everlasting, ever growing, ever rupturing, ever coming. Just like when Newton's laws were enhanced and ruptured, came Einstein's laws. And ever progressing and moving. Because Marxism is a science, whether people want to agree or not. Moreover, the same applies to the contributions of Mao, and the same would apply to the contributions of Che Guevara, or to the contributions of Amilcar Cabral. Contributions which recognize that Marxism in itself a growing body of scientific knowledge, that one has the ontology, one has a epistemology, and that from there one must move towards dealing with the particularities that occur in any given place at any given time. So I'm going to look up two words. Let me first make sure I know where I'm at. So we're going to look up ontology, just real quick. People might know what ontology is, but it's also good for me. Define ontology. So ontology is a branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of a being. Then there's a second part. It says a set of concepts and categories in the subject area of domain that shows their properties and the relations between them. I think it's number 2. And now we're going to look up epistemology. Define epistemology.
Epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge. It examines its origins, nature, methods, and boundaries, exploring questions like what knowledge is, how we get it, and what makes it valid.
So epistemology is a branch of philosophy concerned with theory and knowledge, focus on its origins, nature, methods, and limits. So that is epistemology. All right, back to it. And this would certainly move Marxism far beyond these mundane restricted limits which have been forced upon it by some theoreticians. In a practical day-to-day struggle of the developing world, irrespective of whether people accept some of these arguments, and you may think that they are esoteric, and that the day-to-day struggles does necessarily take account of these arguments. Marxism continues to grow as a developing world ideology, in spite of the attempts to present it as something alien to the developing world. It continues to grow as a independent ideology seeking clear alternatives to capitalism, in spite of the attempts to divert this process by focusing on a comparison between capitalism and socialism. That comparison is something I shan't discuss at any length because, again, the moment that one takes the care to understand Marx's ideology, it becomes immediately obvious that one cannot be a foot in both camps. It is not possible to talk about the coexistence, definitely, of the socialist and capitalist system. There may be, at a certain point of transition, the incorporation of elements which are capitalist in a socialist system, or vice versa. But if that is so, then we will have to examine the tendency. We will have to examine which of the contradictory features is manifesting itself ultimately to become the dominant system. But it is impossible for someone such as Leopold Senghor to say, in Senegal, we will have a little bit of capitalism and a little bit of socialism, and then a little bit of Senegalesism. But this is in effect what he says. He says we're going to have 3 sectors of our economy. We will have the foreigners owning something. Then we'll have a section that is publicly owned, and then we will have a and will have some joint ownership. And this is put forward as socialist alternative, or the alternative to Marxism. A very conscientiously, Senegal puts this forward as the alternative to Marxism. It seems a bit utopianism with that, because it's a whole bunch of contradictions within inside itself. Yet one of the many fallacies in this position is that Senegal began as a capitalist country. It is located within the international imperialist order. The Senegalese people were not, I'm changing the page, were not making any choice about whether they want to be either capitalist or socialist. They were in fact capitalist. The only choice they can make is whether they want to continue to be located within a capitalist system or whether they want to escape from it. So it is a false duality to imagine that they are outside of either system and that they are choosing from both to create a third alternative. And any steps which fail to remove it from the capitalist system are steps which in effect support capitalist systems. The rise of Marxism in the developing world. They use the number 3. Quite apart from examining it at the level of the theoretical implications, one is struck by the sizable increase in Marxism, or to put it more effectively, the increase in the adherence to Marxism, the increase of the discussion of Marxism, the increase of the awareness of Marxism, and in the developing world. All of these strategies persuaded by Africans and Latin Americans and Asian people to stem the tide of Marxism haven't really been effective, because while it may be difficult for anyone to say, for instance, that in Asia in 1965 there were 10,000 Marxists, now there were 20,000, and now there are 20,000. That sort of exact quantitative description, we know, may not be possible. I am certain that there would be no observers or analysts of the scene who would deny the increase in Marxism and the adherence to Marxism. And this increase can be measured in a number of indirect ways. It can be measured, for instance, by seeing the number of scholars who are using the formal tools of Marxist analysis, anthropologists and economists, political scientists, historians from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, who 5 or 10 years ago would never have been found on the scene. And the scene are today not in the majority, but they are conspicuous in each field. Very often conspicuous by their excellence, because they are engaging in hard original work which challenges bourgeoisie assumptions and managed to assert itself on the basis of its own internal logic and consistency. So that the glance at the journals from the point of view of those of us in the academic community will indicate to you the growing number of Marxists who are practicing in every discipline in the developing world countries. And this is not because they are encouraged. One can be very sure of that. This is itself a dialectical development, a development over and against the trend of their formation, because they were formed mentally in bourgeoisie philosophy, as I said earlier. The second measure is to look. I'm going to look, make sure no one says anything. Hello. How does communism help black people? Liberation from the exploitations of colonialism, imperialism, and the pillaging and thieving and stealing of those resources by extracting of the Western world. Buenas noches. Yes. Exactly, it's a science. Got it. Perfect. And it's Satan doesn't want to co-host. A second measure is to look outside of the universities, or beyond the levels of university academics, at the number of student groups, the number of working groups, or independent intellectual groups that are avowedly Marxist. Not just that one may say that they are using some Marxist terminology, or that they are discussing their Marxist content. Nowadays, in the developing world, these are the large number of groups which come forward to say, we are Marxist. Now again, I am trying to avoid, from the moment the discussion has to whether they come forward and say they are Marxist or Maoist, or they come forward and say they are something else, but they come forward and say that they are Marxist. That much is certain, and that is a very important change. That is part of our contemporary scene, because in most parts of the developing world, it is still hazardous to identify oneself as a Marxist. And therefore, the fact that it is happening more and more is an indication of a tremendous growth of the willingness, of the capacity to challenge the domination of bourgeoisie thought. It doesn't call it. No, dude, you need to understand the origins of where communism comes from in the first place. Alongside these groups, very often as part of the activity of the groups, we have a proliferation of journals which carry Marxist slogan, which carry Marxist analysis. These are things that can be discovered through the random sample, just looking through random samples. Just looking through the developing world, especially if one has the opportunity to see the literature that comes out at what we call the grassroots level. Literature that is not necessarily put into the same glossy format as Time or Fortune magazine, but literature that comes through the hard sweat and labor of people turning a centener. I'm gonna look up this word. Let me look up this word. Oh my God. You're all dealing with that person in the comments saying that communism is not good for black people, huh? Funny how like black people have been the cornerstone of liberation from the I forgot what I was gonna say. God damn it. What is this? It's gonna let me say it? Of course it's not gonna let me say it. Gastentener, which is a stencil duplicator machine that was a precursor to modern photocopier. Very often by hand, not even electrically, and producing things that may not be the most attractive to look at, but which carry out the task of Marxist reconsideration of society. Marxism is growing in the developing world, and I don't think that this is merely because of some theoretical subtlety on part of the Marxists themselves. If indeed this has any part to play, rather it appears to me to derive from the practical experience of the developing world over the last decade and a half, a practical experience gained since countries in Africa and Asia in particular achieved their so-called independence, their nominal constitutional independence. Ever since the independence, these countries have had certain experiences. They have had set out, for instance, to develop themselves. Rather that means rather that means to anybody else. But they very often had a conscious vision of developing, of advancing, and in doing so, or in attempting to do so, they utilize a well-known bourgeoisie theoretical assumption about how one develops. They utilize bourgeoisie advisors to set up their 4- and 5-year development plans. They utilize bourgeois international experts to tell them how to take off. And these are the Commodore classes. And the result is there for everyone to see. It is a failure of bourgeoisie thought to deliver the goods, if you like. That is one of the most important considerations in explaining away the alternative philosophical view is gaining ground, because when the bourgeoisie theorists had before them the new field of independent African countries, then it could be said that they must be given the chance to prove whether they are right or wrong about capitalism being a road of development for everyone. But after 10 or 15 years, in some cases, in Asian countries, much longer than that, it is no longer possible to say that bourgeoisie theory has any possibilities of growth up for the developing world countries. Even the liberals, even the neoclassical economists themselves are turning towards Marxism-inspired visions and understanding of what is dependency, and what is underdevelopment, and what are the ways out of these states of dependencies and underdevelopment. So it is the practice which accounts in no small measures for the advance of Marxism in the developing world. Class struggle in the developing world. I'm gonna go back. I don't see anybody else. All right. There is also a recognition that the developing world cannot stand outside of the rest of the international societies. It certainly cannot be considered in isolation from the rest of the capitalist world, nor, for that matter, can it isolate itself from those parts of the world which have made socialist revolutions. This recognition came very clearly, or most clearly, and it came at the earlier period of Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, a tremendous development of the Vietnamese struggle. It came also in Latin America, because the Latin Americans had been independent for a long time, and after this political independence, they have had a long experience of neocolonialism, an experience which forced them to recognize that there was no way in which they could understand the movement of Latin American society without understanding the interpenetration of foreign, mainly American capital, monopoly capital into Latin America environment. So that they began to build into their understanding of their society and understanding of the larger society. And if they had to understand the larger society, they automatically had to go back to the understanding capitalism and to seeing why it was, or why it is, that capitalism enslaves not only its working class, but indeed more so the working class and the dispossessed peoples of the developing world. One of the interesting choices which have been made by most developing world political spokesmen, choices at the ideological level, is a choice based on their unwillingness to recognize that class can be relevant in their own context. That there was some factual basis for that unwillingness. Many developing world countries began their period of political independency with the internal class struggle. at the very low levels because the internal classes had been subordinated to external capital. And the operations of internal class struggle had been subordinated to the operations of the nationalist struggle of all classes against the external monopoly capitalism. But as the years advanced, since independence in the developing world countries, the evidence began to grow of a decisive role of internal class struggles, of the growth of indigenous classes played decisive roles in the motion of the internal society. And this has also been a potent factor in forcing developing world peoples to come to grips with an analysis which has room for understanding the world in terms of class struggle. An example which is always very clear and very illustrative is the example of Ghana. The development of thought of Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah had always had some Marxist overtones before he got into power. And when he got into power, there was a time when he used to describe himself as a Marxist and a Christian. There was a time when he used to describe himself as a conscientist. A conscientist. Let me make sure I'm going to say this word. Hopefully it'll let me say the word. It says conscientiousness, EST. Conscientious, and I can't say it. So I got to hear it. If it does it. Oh my gosh, come on. I didn't say that. Hold on, everybody. I'm still working on it. IST. Oh my gosh. It's a conscientism. I can't say it. A philosophy and ideology developed by Kwame Nkrumah for decolonization and reconstruction of the African society. He spoke of himself as a Pan-Africanist. He attempted to incorporate some Marxist insight, but not as a total methodology, not as something that underlay his whole political philosophy and his political practice, largely because he insisted that there were no classes in Ghana. And then he was overthrown and he went to Guinea, and he was given an aid by his friend Sake Toure. And in his last days, he produced a considerable body of writings, and in this writing he proclaimed, "I used to say that there was no classes, but when I was overthrown by the Ghanaian petty bourgeoisie class, I discovered that there were classes." If you read Nkrumah's Class Struggle in Africa, that is basically what he was saying. What he is saying. He very clearly, in his own way, delimits the classes in Africa and accepts that the petty bourgeoisie functions as a class in its own right, with interests hostile to the African working class and peasantry. And he is therefore able to reformulate his vision of Ghana and of Africa, or he did it so before he died. Nkrumah, of course, was one of the foremost nationalists. He stood on the vanguard of nationalist struggle. But that block to his full understanding came because he could not or would not think of it. I think it is a combination of the two, perceiving the development of class inside of Ghana. Today, the obvious growth of indigenous classes throughout Asia and the Caribbean, Latin America, and the rest of the developing world is a clear pointer to the need to grasp the strategies which recognize, or which is based upon the recognition of the existing class struggle as a motive force in history. And here again, Marxism comes in for an additional attention on the part of the developing world scholars. Of course, to say that Marxism is relevant does not necessarily say that the body of Marxist thought which exists is adequate to the understanding of the developing world predicament. These are two different questions in different orders of logic, and I think they have been confused by a number of people. Marxism as a operative methodology in political philosophy, as an ideology which sprang from the working class in Europe, has developed its own. We can measure physically the body of literature which has been produced by Marxists, and their literature has been preoccupied with Western Europe, with North America, and with the developed countries, because most of the Marxists came from those countries. And even developing world Marxists in the early days were concerned with metropolitan society. So there is a body of Marxist literature which is inadequate to the need of the developing world, because it does not deal, for the most part, with the problems of the developing world. So that when one says that Marxism is relevant to the developing world, it means that the Marxist scholar, whether he be developing world of the developing world origins or not, who attempts to deal with Marxism in the developing world, must be operating at the most advanced and creative level. He is not merely transferring known truths from other parts of the world to Africa or Asia's situation. He has to engage in a very difficult task of building from the bottom of actual body of Marxist inquiry, the Marxist analysis of societies in question. And this is where one has to emphasize once again that Marxism can only be of value if whatever it takes to be the universal is applied to the particular, and it is in the very particularity of the exercise that one will demonstrate that the universal is actually universal, and that it is applicable. Kind of like the universality of like the mass line theory. It's applicable to time and space in different conditions. In the United States, for instance, there has been, and no doubt there has been, a spillover of the same discussions in Canada. Very lengthy, sometimes very violent discussions among black brothers and sisters about the relevance of Marxism. It basically comes from the understanding of whether this Marxism has any validity to black people in their special predicament as an ethnic group. And the argument against its applicability are rather similar to the arguments in which an African or a West Indian might use the sort of arguments I have outlined above. In other words, those who are opposed would say that Marxism is about class, and our problem is a racial or ethnic problem. Marxism originated with the same Western society which dominates us, and we must reject all forms of white culture domination, Marxism included. However, there continues to be a growth of a serious interest in Marxism on the part of Afro-Americans, the black population of the United States, and their task quite clearly consists of bringing the tools of Marxism to bear upon the specific histories of the United States. In that specific history, a number of contradictions arose, and if the contradictions between races happens to be a fundamental contradiction, when that is the contradiction which will attract their attention, they will have to come up with a formulation which deal with the specifics of their own social situation. Failure to do so does in fact strengthen the arguments of those who try to suggest that Marxism is irrelevant. Because if you proceed into a situation, rather it be analysis of Afro-America or an analysis of Pakistan, and you do not attempt to develop with respect of those specific situations, but rather merely to transfer a body of knowledge in a fixed static form from another part of the world, then you will be accused of being irrelevant. You will be accused of cultural hegemony. You will be accused of trying to force the indigenous interpretations into your own internal imperialist orientated model. The burden of the developing world Marxist. Look back real quick. I don't see anybody saying anything really. The live didn't complete the Go Popular mission? What? I don't understand that. Sorry. I'm just saying that now. That is, okay, the burden of the developing world Marxist. That is why I think that the responsibility which developing world Marxists carry is an extremely heavy responsibility. In Western Europe, in North America, it is possible to plug into an existing body of thought. Any discussion about Marxism in these parts can immediately find some source of established Marxist orthodoxy. They can find the unorthodoxies. They can, in fact, adjudicate between all kinds of rival versions to Marxism, rival versions to Marxism in its application to their own society. It doesn't mean that Western Marxists do not function in revitalize or to review the Marxist vision of his own society. But he has something to review. The developing world scholar is more often than not starting from a very beginning, having nothing to review, having nothing else but sometimes inadequate empirical data which has to be collated and picked up from bourgeoisie sources. And because they have to be lifted out of a bourgeoisie context, you often find yourself in the very difficult positions, because it is not entirely impossible to separate the data from the conceptualization which might have lain behind the inquiries, and which therefore influence the particular types of data was collected. Where was I at? So the developing world Marxists will find themselves starting from scratch, but it is a task that has to be carried out, because to do otherwise is precisely to fall into the hands of those who want to sort of cultural exceptionalism and who will say that Marxism is not for us because it is inimical and antithetical to our own culture and our own history. The record so far is very clear that capitalism has been on the retreat, and Marxist-Leninism started out undoubtedly as something within Europe, and is today, of course, embraced by 800 million Chinese people, which itself always makes me wonder why it is that people still say that Marxism is a white ideology. One would have thought, if the ideology is to be colored by the majority of people of color of its inherence, then Marxism is to be called they use the color Asian ideology, but they use the word yeah. And if it is a Asian ideology, or is capable of being Asian And if it is capable of being brown, in the case of some Asian countries, of being black in the case of Cabral's Guinea, or of Mozambique under Frelimo, then immediately one sees that there are very many breaches that are made in this wall, which was being built, or which certain people attempt to build around Marxism to keep it from the world's latest developed peoples. My own contribution is merely to bring this to the attention of the developing world scholars, for the most part developing world students, because in an institution such as this, one will of course come into contact with Marxist ideology, but inevitably Marxist ideology will be the submerged ideology. The dominant ideology is going to be the ideology of the ruling class. As I have caused to tell my students many years ago at University of Dar es Salaam, when someone asked how they should know which is bourgeoisie ideology, which textbook they should take up, which one will have a bourgeoisie view, and which will have a capitalist view, I told them that they could go into the library and close their eyes and stick out their hand, and the chances are they would have got a bourgeoisie book, so that they could proceed on that assumption. They don't have to select. Just close your eyes, feel around, grab any number of books, and you're dealing with bourgeoisie worldview. Now, at the same time, there are possibilities. There are possibilities which perhaps when we live in the metropoles, we do not appreciate them until we go back to the developing world countries from which we came. The possibilities lie in the contradictions of this society, and the fact that Marxist thought, irrespective of all these things, is in fact present, and that literature is available, and that faculties for inquiry are available. One could urge therefore that even within the realms of institutions that are designed to carry out a particular ideological function, it is possible to conduct a sort of guerrilla intellectual war, by which one will have access not to that which was designed specifically for one, but access which hinges upon the dialectical transition beyond that which was intended for one. There are many things which I believe the developing world scholars can grasp, in spite of the quite conscious attempt on the part of all of our institutions, including those of the developing world, to reformulate us and to continue to program us as bourgeoisie thinkers. And that's the end of that chapter. Next, chapter 5. Hello. Chapter 5. Labor as a conceptual framework in Pan-African studies. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. At the most fundamental level, the Pan-African historian has to be engaged in the study of either the African continent or the African peoples abroad. It is not at all necessary that he has to be concerned with the links between the two. Nevertheless, there are a number of ways in which the connection can be and has been approached. The two most outstanding would seem to be the choice of a subject that in itself spans Africa and Africans in the New World, such as the slave trade and the Pan-African movement, and B, the search for the African roots of particular New World culture phenomenons, notably religion and music. The purposed use of, quote, labor as a conceptual framework of Pan-African studies is in addition to and not a replacement of the already established modes of approach. The ways in which people organize their labor and the tools with which they work provide at entry to the study of all history from the time that early man was capable of fashioning a crude pebble tool in East Africa. Furthermore, labor is the basis for all global approaches to human history, which presents their analysis in terms of class and other social formations. This universality has certain disadvantages, since African history must be evaluated not as a discrete, not as a discrete and isolated entity, but as a part of human development. Useful conceptual approaches should therefore facilitate comparisons with other areas of the world. The contention here is that there have been certain particularities in the way that Africans have worked or have been forced to work, and those labor patterns over the past few centuries have largely determined the relations between Africans and non-Africans. And within the present stage of the world development, that one finds the initial justification supposing that the labor concept can be a major unity of Pan-African history, because no overview of the world today can fail. I gotta do a thing. It's a birdie. Oh my gosh, come on. Hey, I did it. Okay. Hold on. Overview of the world today can fail to deal with the contrasts between the rich and the poor nations, between what are essentially the white and non-white peoples of our planet, and underpinning those contrasts are difference in the type of labor performed and the technology of work. What appears in popular jargon as, quote, the difference between the haves and the have-nots, end quote, is vitally identical with what economists term, quote, the international division of labor, end quote. Just as bourgeoisie intellectuals take the relationship between capital and labor as a, quote, given, and almost as a, quote, neutral factor. So they tend to treat the international division of labor in a static fashion, depriving it of its broad historical dimensions. As a result, it is argued that the international trade network, which is so disadvantageous to the underdeveloped countries, is based on different comparative cost advantages in production. It is said that the differences are attributable to different resource endowments, and that the world trade enhances the specialization of production in all participating countries. This argument incorporates certain obvious absurdities, which content. Hold on, I'm gonna make sure that I'm saying this word right. It's another obvious word that I'm like second guessing myself. I hate when I do that. Let's see. Continent. Wait, no, is that it? Hold on, let me make sure. Probably is. Oh my gosh, come on. Oh my gosh, I didn't do that. What am I missing here? What the fuck? Okay, yeah. Continent is richer than Africa in natural resources. Okay, let me read that. Which continent is richer than Africa in natural resources? And yet Africa is the least specialized except in lines of production that requires the least skill, are least remunerative, and most vulnerable within the international capitalist system. Africans peoples everywhere, both within the continent and abroad, fall within the category of the poor and underdeveloped and the under-specialized. The explanation for this must be seen in historical perspectives, and it involves a close look at the ways Africans have worked prior and subsequent to involvement within Europe and the Americas. There have indeed been a great deal of scattered studies on African labor which are illuminating, even though they are not necessarily informed by an awareness that similar tendencies were operating wherever Africans worked, and that there were slowly building into an international pattern. What follows below is a mere sketch of a possibility that might be opened up by not necessarily informed by an awareness that similar tendencies were operating wherever Africans worked, and that there were slowly building into an international pattern. What follows below is a mere sketch of a possibility that might be opened up by looking at the Vesta of Africa before the white man. 2. So what he's doing is he's going through what we're going to read about now. So the first thing he's going to read about is Africa before the white man, Africa under white slave owner abroad, Africans under white slave owners abroad, Africa in the epoch of the internationalization of trade, 15th and mid 19th century. 4. Africans in post-slavery America. 5. The foreign exploitation of African labor within the continent, late 19th century to present. So here we go. We're gonna hit each point, right? Number 1, Africa before white man. The number of issues to be considered in this category, and this is important because this is called historical materialism. To understand the past, to understand where we're at right now, so you can figure out the distinctions and stuff, and the contradictions, and the class relations and shit like that. The number of issues to be considered in this category are numerous. Many are brought together within the debate about feudalism in Africa, which was once keenly conducted among historians of Africa and has now virtually petered out as far as English-speaking scholars are concerned. However, within the Francophone circles, there is still... Now, Francophone, I think, is a fascist... Let me look up Francophone. And I think these are the colonies from France. I think these are French colonies. They call them Francophones. I'm not sure. Let me look it up. Francophone. Speaking French. A person who speaks French. Okay. This is a person who speaks French, according to the dictionary. All right. Francophone circles. There is still a stimulating discussion about whether there was a distinctive African mode of production. These issues involve comparisons. Now, we're going to read over these things too, because he is, and how Europe underdeveloped Africa, he'll maintain, and he'll say what Africa was before, what it developed, what economies it developed, and everything. Yeah, these these issues involve comparison not only with Europe, but also with Asia, since it was Europe which subsequently came into contact with Africa. It is well It is well to understand the features of Africa and European society that determined their respective roles and subordination and domination. Naturally, the nature of African work reflected the environment and social interest. The African skills were developed in direction different from those of Europe. For example, West Africa in the 15th century boosted skills in brass casting and plastic arts, advancing techniques in canoe building and river travel, and notions of agriculture relevant to tropical forests, savannas, and swamps. Europe, on the other hand, had superiority to some extent in arms technology, and to a overwhelming extent in shipbuilding, navigation, administrations, and accounting. Let's bring someone else up. Crudely speaking, it could be said that by the 15th century, European labor and technology was more advanced than its African counterpart, and hence the European capacity to exploit Africa through trade. But there is a scope for a more comprehensive analysis, which would pinpoint the precise area of social dissimilarities vis-a-vis Africa and Europe. And it was over a period of time that the dissimilarities transformed themselves into advantages and disadvantages. For instance, Africa lacked a technological dynamic leading towards mass production. When mass production became the norm in Europe, a decisive factor in world trade, when African handicraft skills turned out to be a disadvantage. This did not come into effect until the 19th century, when Europe came to define what was developed and what was not, with their own technologies and way of life held up as a standard of excellence for, quote, those who can define are the masters, end quote, and vice versa. In order to start the reconstruction of Pan-Africanism with a clean slate, it would be helpful to understand in what direction African labor had been developing at the time that we were our own masters. Number 2, Africa under white slave owners abroad. An interesting sidelight of the slave trade, which has never been brought into view, is the extent to which many agriculture, mining, handicrafts, craft skills are transported to the New World. The early slave trade to the Spanish in the New World sought labor to engage in mining, cattle raising in the Greater Antilles and on the Spanish Main. Several of the peoples of this Senegamba, can't say it, who were victims of this phase of the slave trade, were experiencing as pastoralists and familiar with open pit mining of gold and iron ore. Cores such as cotton, indigo, and rice were produced in the American colonies and the Caribbean by Africans who were already growing those same crops in their own societies. It could hardly be a mere coincidence that rice production was successfully launched in the Brazilian state of Maranhão. It's Maranhao with a hyphen, or I don't know what it's called. It's a squiggly on top of the A. Sorry. In the mid 18th century, just at the moment when African labor was being brought in from traditional rice farming sectors in Upper Guinea. Nevertheless, as has been argued by several scholars, the slave regime was hostile to the formation of new or sophisticated skills within the Western tradition. Slave labor was meant to be the cheapest possible, and it consequently had to be unskilled, carrying out the simplest task with the crudest of tools. Otherwise, there would have been specialization and division of labor far beyond the managerial capacity of the overseers and whips. Slavery never evolved beyond backward agriculture, so industrialization was out of the question. Meanwhile, in Europe, the bourgeoisie were forced constantly to renovate their means of production, which meant enhancing the skills of their own white workers. The slave sojourn in Americas and in India, in the Indian Ocean, and in Europe by Africans gave the first clear indication of the development of a broad gap in labor performance and technologies between white and black races. It's because they kept them underdeveloped so they can continuously get free labor. So he said it right there. They utilized it to highly exploit them and kept them underdeveloped so they couldn't engage in certain technologies and stuff on purpose. Africa in the epoch of internationalization of trade, beginning with the Congo, Europeans showed themselves unwillingly to ascend to African conquest for the importation of new techniques from Europe, although the Congolese requested masons, doctors, apothecaries, and teachers. This refusal was repeated when Dahomey and Asante made similar requests in the 18th century. Europe was consciously blocking the spread of technology, which is a center feature in the emergence of a more scientific mode of production. Both in Europe and later in Japan, Africans received cheap consumer goods, while Europe secured gold for expanding its monetary economy and labor to create value and open up a whole brave new world in the Americas. The impact of the slave trade on the African laboring population is obviously a topic of what would of necessity be examined if one is interested in how African labor has fared historically. The only comment offered here is by way of rejection of the recent trends of studies assessing the slave trade. The approach begins by suggesting, with justification, that the figures of slaves imported have been greatly exaggerated in the past. There follows a conclusion that the slave trade was therefore far less significant within African history than it was previously made out to have been. The conclusion is a sequitur? Sequitur. What's a sequitur? What's a non sequitur? It says, yeah, non sequitur. I think that's what it is. Let me look. Make sure I'm saying it right.
بليز يا عمو وقفت هدية بليز. الله يوفقك يا عمو. بليز ساعدني قفت.
Here we go. Non sequitur meaning. Let's see if it says it. I gotta turn it up.
Non sequitur.
Yeah, non sequitur. Wait, did I spell it right? Yeah. Which means a conclusion of statement that does not logically follow from the previous argument or statement. Non sequitur, since the impact must be measured for specific places at particular times. At the end of the 17th century, the ports of what is now Dahomey were loading 30,000 victims per year, and this was sustained for decades. The hinterlands of the of the Bight of Biafra had its turn at the end of the 18th century, while the heavy flow came from Lake Nassia in the decades before 1850. These are three of the main instances, and to find a point of comparison in European history, it would be necessary to look at what transpired during the 30 Years' War in Germany and during the two world wars in Europe. Besides, in Europe, such wars contributed to the development of a particular type of society, so that after all the casualties and all the disruptions, opportunities were provided to building bigger things by combining capital, science, and skilled labor in every more daring way. What did the slave trade build in Africa? Nothing but a bridge leading to the next phase of exploitation, where the present International Division of Labor came into its own. Let's see here. I'm going to read one more since it's like 15 minutes. Let's see. Maybe I might read more than... Actually, I'll probably... let me know. Africa in post-slavery America. Africans in the New World fared little better than slavery in terms of making their labor more scientific and appropriating more benefits to themselves. In the West Indies and the United States, many ex-slaves were frustrated in their attempts to set up an independent peasantry, or instead they became rural proletariats or quasi-serfs under the name of sharecroppers. There was diversification of black labor into trades and petty commerce, but nothing which could upset the basic pattern of American society, where capital came either from whites at home or abroad, and where the dominant technology was in the hands of the whites. For the vast majority of the New World, black people phrased such a, quote, the reserve army of labor, quote, labor reservoir, and, quote, last hire, first fire, adequately sum up the position. The reference to black community in the U.S. as a internal colony has many justifications, not least of which is the remarkable fact that black labor within industrial America was virtually the same relations to whites in terms of skills as does continental African labor with regards of Europe and white Americans. Since the emancipation, the necessity of obtaining modern scientific labor skills was always appreciated at different levels of perception by sectors of the black population in America. There was an awareness that real equality with whites would follow only after the acquisition of the technique that was equal to that of the oppressor. And this explains the tremendous drive towards education within the first generations of legally free black people. Of course, since whites retained political power, there were 1,000 ways in which they could thwart the achievements of that objective, and those who broke through the education cordon simply made a contribution to establishing white technology. The few exceptions to the rule were individuals who sought to aid black political liberation and to build up a tradition of independent black activities on both sides of the Atlantic. I think I can read one more. Let's find out. Oh yeah, I was reading the whole chapter. 5. The foreign exploitation of African labor within the continent. Having tired of exploiting African labor abroad in chattel form, the international capitalist system with Western Europe at its epicenter transferred its interest to African labor on the continent, setting up a political apparatus of colonialism. At the same time, the European scholars, including non-Marxists, attest to the tremendous role play by capital in imperialist expansion. In industrial society, the concept of capital automatically calls to mind that of the laborer. But it is worth noting that on the African continent in the colonialist era, labor was held back by the colonialists using several means of additions, in addition to the provision of fixed capital and wages. The colonial period is the best documented in African history, both from the viewpoint of written record and the accessibility of orally preserved records. Studies to date on forced labor, migration, peasant cash crops production, the proletarianization of labor in South Africa, and so forth, have tremendous scopes to be expanded to cover the whole continent. Those areas of history are so close to the present that their significance in influencing conditions in Africa as they are today is virtually self-evident. Within the field of contemporary history, it becomes even more vital to forge a mature social science approach which attempts to grapple with political economy in its historical perspectives. Analytically, the labor factory has the advantage of being valid for several academic disciplines, and it can therefore be pivotal in arriving at an overview of the state of the nation in Africa and in particular part of the continent. Conclusion. We re-emphasize that the above is a mere outline of possibilities. Certain criticisms concerning a mission can be avoided. However, there is one particular limitation that is perhaps inherent in the approach, namely that it tends to treat African history using external and largely European frames of references. For instance, quote, Africa before the white man, end quote, might suggest that the coming of the whites at the particular point in time marked an entirely new phase in the continent's history. Needless to say, areas of Africa have continued with their own dynamic virtually up to the present, and one has to be careful in distinguishing where the European presence was merely one factor among many and where it was the sole or dominant factor. Besides that, there is a danger attendant upon the interpretations based on isolating one variable. The conclusion could be lopsided if the great deal of attention is not paid to the interrelations between the variable and the numerous others which are always involved in any historical reconstruction. Occasionally, some historians deny that the writings of history is an exercise of contemporary politics. Yet many among those would subscribe to the non-hackneyed adage that, quote, every generation rewrites its own history according to its own lights, end quote, which is another way of saying that the base of operation is always a contemporary social political scene. In any event, Pan-African historians have largely taken it upon themselves to make it explicitly clear that history and the writings of history must be used as means of liberation of our people. This does not necessarily mean that the historian, qua historian, is in the front line of the struggle, or that he he has ready solutions, but at least he should be called upon to investigate areas relevant to an understanding of the present predicament of black peoples around the world. Looking at our labor history should provide some further insights into the differentiation of labor skills and technologies, which is now so characteristics of white/black relations, and it has the added advantage of underscoring the sameness of historical experience of people scattered in different parts of the world. And that's the end of the chapter. And we'll do the Angola question. So they're talking about how the histories and how like they need to go and look at the different social relations to productions and the labor movements and the laborers and to identify, so that way they can understand. And he says that a lot of African historians have a hard time with this due to colonization, is due to the fact that African laborers were not put into like scenarios where they had technological advancements in the way to engage in production, and they were continuously being exploited through colonial efforts. So they took away that, because when you'll see this in the next book that I read, that they utilize to disperse the black laborers. They utilize indentured servitude by bringing people from India in to displace them. So yeah. And the fact that also they were also taken and stolen and supplanted in other parts of the globe to do free labor or forced labor. You know, so there's that too. Yes, and to erase their actual like markets and their ways of trade and their way of life to take advantage of them, because they didn't need the technologies of battle, of weaponry. You know what I mean? They were focused on other things. So yeah, part of making a country dependent is destroying those things, giving them supplies that are like, and how Europe under developed Africa, they gave them secondhand stuff that was low quality on purpose. They gave them the secondhand stuff and not the high quality stuff, which is creating a dependency. You know what I mean? So yeah. What's up, Doodley?
Yeah, I just I got invited by Boyd. Yeah, I put in the comments how they center white tea voices as well when it comes to history. Mm-hmm. And that has largely to do with the fact that it's the only view that has the power of getting out there without much pushed back. Yeah. I would say so too. And the fact that they also have to require. So like Africa, part of the colonization effort was the Catholic Church, right? The missionaries trying to get in and penetrate those lines, those hinterlands, and then they utilize military efforts, and then they even utilized doctors to get in closer and penetrate even further in. You know what I mean? By creating like diseases and saying we can solve your, you know what I mean, and all those things. You know. So and then teaching the white ways, the white histories and like all those things, instead of them learning from their histories, their historical materialist history, instead of being taught white history, white European history, to do indoctrination to separate them from their culture and their societies, and
and to assimilate into white society.
Yeah,
as
Christian.
as free labor, low labor, and forced labor. You know what I mean?
Yeah, especially like white Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Like Christianity has been used for oppressing people since its inception.
Yeah. So we'll get into this more when we read how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Because even that book, it needs to be said. Even if that book, he's going to talk about the difference between development and underdevelopment. So he'll say that. He'll mention those things. And he'll go over that and why it's defined as underdevelopment and why it is. You know, he'll come up with examples and stuff. I don't know if he'll do it in this book, but he'll do it in how Europe underdeveloped Africa for sure. You know, because it's important to understand what is the meaning of underdeveloping a country, and to suit the needs of the Western imperialist forces. You know. What up, Void? What you want? What you gonna say?
Hello, I got news.
What's your news?
I'm about to stream on the Twitch if anybody wants to watch.
Oh, you're streaming on Twitch. Void is streaming on Twitch. What are you playing on Twitch?
Call the Vet.
Yeah?
Yeah. So if anybody wants to come and say hi, I'll be doing that momentarily. I'm literally just setting it up now.
Now there's room. Now there's room for Two Spirit.
Okay.
Touch the wood.
No, they don't have to come up. They don't want to. It's fine. You know. But yeah, this is a good book. I like it. That was a little bit. I had to actually a little bit pay attention to things, and I didn't grasp things completely. So, you're in the request. What the hell? My mods aren't doing the shit. No, you're not. You're not in the request. Here, we'll just do this. Oh, there they are.
See, it's like magic. Poof. I pop even when I'm not in the request.
Who gave you these powers?
I got super omni powers. I can just poof up on panels anytime I wish.
I know. I need some of that stuff. I need some of that power. That'd be great power. You know? But, yeah.
I will say, though, that with talking about, religion just as its own, if you haven't checked out the most recent video I posted on this, people should check it out. Because here's the thing. There are a lot of comrades out there that won't do the calling out of what I'm going to refer to as the big three. And if you actually think about what has been written by Marx, by Lenin, and many others, which I do mention in the video, so if you check it out, let me know, that we should be critiquing all of the big three, because the big three justify harm to the people, and on top of that justify harm to the revolution. So we should be critiquing the big three, as in the big three religions. So just putting it up.
Yeah, okay. Big three religions. Yeah, I agree. The Abrahamic religions need to be critiqued because they're I would say, in Christianity and stuff, they're bourgeoisie thought. And they're them to subjugate people and to pretend that you don't have to do anything because one day you'll get heaven. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it separates the person from the world they're in. It's meant to, like I said before, Christianity since its inception was used to oppress people, and as we know, the purpose of a system is what it does. And if that's what Christianity does, I think it needs to be seen as an oppressive system as well.
Yeah.
Here's all I'm going to say, and it's the same thing I say in the video. Yeah, and I do agree, Ron. There's a lot of people that are comfortable with just Christianity as their critique, but the other two cause just as much harm. We have justification of harming people of the LGBTQIA plus in all three of the biblical texts, less so in the Jewish text, but it's still there. Then on top of that, we also have the harming of people that they deem quote unquote lesser than, and I said they deem, and a lot of times this comes down to people of the Black community, of the indigenous community. Then on top of that, we also have it from all three will justify like atrocities to children, and it comes from all three. And we can see this in a prime example in Yemen. They use the justification of one of the three. Again, if you watch my video, you'll find out which three, to justify lowering the age of consent to the age of 9. So again, these are problems that are being justified through these biblical texts. And without critiquing them, we actually are just saying that we're okay with it. If you're not willing to critique it, at that point, you're no different than the person that says they are okay with these atrocities using these texts.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Or also how all of them have a view of disability as a curse.
It does say that in there too. You obviously I said that too multiple times there.
Yeah. So what's everybody thinking about the book so far? Is it good?
Yeah.
Yeah? Yeah? I think it's good. Yeah. Or If We Possessed. Win book. Excellent book. Yep. All right. Does anybody else have anything else to say before I close it out? I know it wasn't that much of a conversation like last time, but it's still a good one, you know?
No, I actually agree. I've been watching off and on. I've had things I was doing, so I've only been able to participate a little bit today. But for the most part, I've been listening in. And yeah, I agree. It's a good book. I've also partially read this book, so I kind of already knew that it was a good book. I haven't fully read it yet, but listening to the end, I have. I have heard it. I haven't read it myself, though.
Yeah, yeah. What's going to come up for us here soon in this book, I'll go bounce ahead a little bit, is the Angolian question. So we're going to figure out what that means. Oh, that's very quick. And then we're going to get into development and underdevelopment. Okay, he's going to go over development and underdevelopment. So we're going to get that. The historical roots of African underdevelopment. So we're going to understand, he's going to go the significance of that. So yeah, I guess it is in this book that we're going to go over that. And it's a long one. It's a long read. It's a whole chapter on it. Holy crap. So yeah, it's very significant, you know what I mean? Because I would say that the indigenous perspective out here, you guys were purposely underdeveloped too, you know, with residential schools, displacement, G-side, unalivements, being, you know what I mean? I would say that happened with the indigenous perspective too out here, you know? Oh, I think Chicky accidentally did it. Am I allowed to say Chicky or should I say chicken? Is that you guys' names?
That's just my thing.
All right, good. I won't say it anymore then. My bad. I sometimes mirror people when I hear you say it. I just I'm going to say it too. So I apologize. You know? What did Joe say? Yeah. All right. What page did we end on? Hold on. Let me find out what page did I end on. Hold on. Let me grab it. I ended on page 84. Chapter 6, 84. Chapter 6, 84. But of course, we had a lot of people talk about how communism is not a lot. But one person came in and talked about how communism is not for black people. Well, then tell that to the comrades that are out there fighting for liberation and for the end of capitalism. Then, you know, tell that to them. You know. But anyways, if no one has anything else to say, I'm going to go ahead and close out. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the support.